I never planned to fall in love over a borrowed book and a cup of coffee, but sometimes the smallest moments become the turning point you didn't know you were waiting for. He wasn't what I expected, calm where I was restless, patient where I was guarded. I bit my lip at his size. Not just his presence, but the space he slowly carved out in the parts of me I'd hidden away for too long. Every glance, every quiet touch, felt like an invitation to trust again, to believe in something gentle and real. This isn't the kind of love story that shouts grand gestures from rooftops. It's a true love story with a romantic touch, built on borrowed books, rainy days, and the choice not to push each other away when it would have been easier to run. And maybe that's what makes it worth telling at all. It was one of those drizzly afternoons that made the city feel softer, like the world had lowered its voice just for a while. I sat alone at my favorite corner table in a small cafe tucked away from the busy street. My laptop was open half-heartedly, displaying an unfinished work report I knew I wouldn't complete today. I liked this spot because no one here ever asked questions or expected answers. Just the quiet hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, the tap of rain against the window. I remember I was stirring my coffee absent-mindedly when the door swung open, letting in a gust of cool air, and a man whose presence seemed too big for the tiny doorway. I only noticed him because, for a second, everyone else did too. The way the barista paused, mid-pour, the old couple by the window looked up from their crossword. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that looked like it never decided whether to stay neat or tousled. He carried a large box in his arms, balancing it carefully so the rain wouldn't soak through. I bit my lip, not because I wanted to, but because I caught myself staring, and it felt like the only way to hide my surprise at how my pulse reacted. I hadn't felt that rush in a long time, not since the last person I let in left me wondering if love was just a word people use to make themselves feel better. He glanced around, trying to find a spot for the box. His eyes landed on the empty chair opposite me. Before I could look away, his gaze caught mine. There it was, that polite half-smile people give. When they're about to ask for a favor, they hope you won't mind. Would you mind if I put this here for a second? I promise I'm not intruding, he said, nodding to the chair across from me. I shrugged and gave him a small smile. Go ahead. Looks heavy. It is, he chuckled, setting it down with care. I noticed the veins on his forearms as he adjusted the box, his sleeves pushed up just enough to show the faint trace of a tattoo. I couldn't quite make out. He thanked me and joined the line at the counter, leaving his box like a silent promise. He'd come back. I tried to turn back to my laptop, but my eyes kept drifting. He ordered a coffee, joked with the barista, said something that made her laugh. There was an ease about him, a warmth that softened the cold air clinging to his coat. When he returned to claim the box, he paused, instead of picking it up. I owe you a coffee for the chair, he said. I raised an eyebrow. You don't owe me anything. Well, how about a thank you coffee then? He tilted his head, waiting for my answer with a patience that made it feel like it was entirely my choice. I could have said no. I could have pointed at my laptop, muttered something about deadlines, but instead, I closed the lid and said, all right. Thank you, coffee. Then, he grinned, set the box aside again, and pulled up the chair. He told me his name, Ethan. Simple, easy to remember. He asked for mine, and when I said it, he repeated it like he wanted to keep it safe somewhere. He told me he'd just moved into a tiny apartment around the corner, and the box was full of old books he'd rescued from his grandmother's attic. He liked the smell of old pages, he said, because they reminded him that stories don't really age, people do. I told him about my unfinished report, my half-finished thoughts, how I liked this cafe because it let me feel invisible when I wanted to. We talked about books, movies, how rain makes everything feel like a secret waiting to be told. He had a way of listening that made me want to keep talking, even about small things. When he laughed, it wasn't loud, but it filled the space-like sunlight sneaking through a window crack, when his coffee cup was empty and the box was waiting. He thanked me again, but before he left, he reached into the box and pulled out a worn paperback. The cover faded, but the title's still clear, a book I'd mentioned loving but hadn't read in years. "Borrow it," he said. "Only condition is, you have to return it to me someday." I wanted to ask when, or how, or if he'd planned this all along, but instead, I just nodded. My fingers brushed his as I took the book, and my pulse did that same reckless dance it had done when he first walked in. He lifted the box again, adjusted it against his chest. I watched him walk back out into the drizzle, the bell above the cafe door giving a soft ring like a promise. I looked down at the book in my hands, tracing the cover with my thumb. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside, something small and warm pressed itself against the part of me that had forgotten how to hope. I didn't know when I'd see him again, but I knew one thing: I wanted to. And maybe wanting was enough to make me stay in that moment a little longer. My heart wide awake, my mind daring to imagine that not every goodbye had to stay that way. A week passed before I saw him again. I had convinced myself the borrowed book was just a nice gesture, that people didn't really follow through on these things anymore. I told myself I'd read it, tuck it away on my shelf, and maybe think of him sometimes when I saw the title. But life has a way of nudging us when we least expect it. It was Saturday morning when I found myself back at the same cafe, the same corner table, the book resting beside my coffee cup like a quiet reminder. I had read it twice already, underlining lines that made me pause, scribbling little notes in the margins in pencil, the way I used to in college. I was halfway through my second cup when I heard his voice behind me, warm and casual, as if no time had passed at all. "You finished it already?" He didn't wait for an answer before he pulled out the chair across from me. He wore a gray sweater this time, sleeves pushed up again, the same calm smile on his face. I held up the book. I did, twice. He looked genuinely pleased, and that pleased me more than I wanted to admit. He ordered us 2 fresh coffees without asking what I wanted. Somehow he already knew. We talked easily, the way you do when the awkward first layer has already been peeled away. He told me about his new apartment, how the boxers were still stacked in the hallway because he couldn't bring himself to unpack them all at once. I told him how I always unpack on the first day, needing to claim a space before it claims me. He teased me about it, but his questions weren't just polite filler. He listened like he was mapping out who I was, piece by piece. I asked what he did for work, and he shrugged, explaining that he was trying to decide if he wanted to keep doing it. Something with numbers, consulting, something he was good at, but not in love with. He asked what made me feel alive lately, and I realized I hadn't really thought about that in a long time. A couple hours slipped by like minutes. I learned he liked old records, that he could cook, but never bothered unless someone else was. Eating too. He said he liked rainy days because they gave him an excuse to slow down. I told him I liked them too because they reminded me not everything has to move fast to feel real. At one point he reached across the table, brushing a crumb from the corner of my mouth with the back of his finger. It was such a small, thoughtless gesture, but it left a warmth on my skin that lingered long after. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. When we stepped outside, the rain had paused, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the bright sky trying to push through. We stood there awkwardly for a second, not quite sure how to say goodbye when neither of us wanted to. He asked if I'd like to join him at a local bookshop next weekend. They were having a sale, he said, but I knew it wasn't about the books. I didn't even pretend to think about it. I said yes before he could finish the sentence. The next few days I found myself checking my phone more than usual. We hadn't exchanged numbers that first time, but he asked for mine before we left the cafe. He sent me a photo later that evening, the cover of a record he found while unpacking, with a simple message. This reminded me of you for some reason. I didn't know what he meant, but it made me smile in the middle of my quiet apartment. When Saturday came, I felt like a teenager again, standing in front of my closet debating over sweaters like any of it really mattered. He greeted me with that same easy grin, pretending to inspect the book I'd returned to him, as if he expected it to be damaged somehow. He held it up to his chest and told me it was his favorite, and now it meant more because of me. At the bookshop, we got lost between the dusty shelves. He found me a battered copy of a poetry collection and read a line out loud, his voice low enough that I could feel it more than hear it. I teased him for being dramatic, but secretly I liked it. He carried my books without asking, his hand brushing mine more than once, until I gave up pretending it was accidental. When we stopped for coffee again, he asked about the last relationship I had. It was the kind of question that could have made everything too heavy, too soon. But he asked it gently, as if he was asking who I'd once been, not what had broken me. I told him, The days that followed felt like pages turning themselves. We didn't talk about what we were, or where it was going. We just kept showing up, which felt more honest than promises we weren't ready to make yet. He'd text me out of nowhere, with lines from books he thought I'd like, or a photo of his coffee with a caption that made no sense but made me laugh anyway. I found myself waiting for those messages, then pretending I wasn't. We started meeting more often, sometimes for no reason at all. One evening, he found me at the grocery store, standing in front of the same shelf, for what felt like forever, because I couldn't decide between two brands of tea. He took both boxes out of my hands and tossed them in my basket without asking, like the decision had never been difficult to begin with. He offered to walk me home, carrying my bag, even though it wasn't heavy. He asked if I wanted company for dinner, and I said yes before I even thought about it. Cooking together in my kitchen turned out to be its own kind of confession. He moved around the small space like he'd done it 1,000 times, asking where I kept things but somehow already knowing. At one point, I stood there with a spoon in my hand, watching him stir a pot of sauce, wondering how this simple moment had become something I didn't know how to live without. We talked about stupid things that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. He told me about the first time he learned to cook, how he'd almost burned down his college dorm trying to impress someone. I asked if it had worked. He said no, but maybe it was practice for now. After dinner we sat on my floor with mismatched mugs of tea, our backs against the couch, his knee brushing mine every time he shifted. He asked if I ever thought about leaving the city. I told him I used to, but now it felt like leaving might mean missing something important. He nodded like he understood, even if he didn't say it out loud. He reached out and tucked my hair behind my ear, the same way he had at my door. Only this time he let his fingers linger at the back of my neck. My breath caught, but I didn't pull away. He leaned in slow enough that I could have stopped him if I'd wanted to. I didn't. His lips were warm, careful, like he knew I'd built walls around parts of myself and he wasn't trying to knock them down all at once. Just a soft promise that maybe he'd be patient enough to wait until I was ready to open the door wider. We didn't talk about what it meant. We didn't need to. Some things feel more honest when they don't come with explanations attached. The next day, I found a note in my mailbox. No envelope, just folded paper with his messy handwriting. I like the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. There was no signature. But it didn't need one, of course. Nothing perfect stays untouched for long. I started feeling it before I saw it. The small uncertainty, the part of me that always waited for the other shoe to drop. One night, we were supposed to meet at the cafe. I got there early, heart drumming its hopeful beat. An hour passed, then two. I told myself he was busy, that something came up, but old ghosts have a way of knocking when they sense a crack in your calm. When I finally stepped outside to leave, I saw him across the street, talking to someone I didn't know. She was pretty, laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm. It shouldn't have meant anything, but my chest tightened in that old, familiar way. The way it does when you're convinced history repeats itself, whether you want it to or not. He looked up, saw me standing there like I'd been caught eavesdropping on a moment that wasn't mine. He started to cross the street, but I turned before he could reach me. I told myself not to overthink it, but that night my mind spun stories faster than sleep could catch up. The next morning, he was at my door before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. He held up his hands like he was trying to show me he wasn't carrying any secrets. The girl, he explained, was his cousin in town for a visit. He laughed at how ridiculous it sounded, then realized I wasn't laughing with him. His smile fell away. He stepped closer, closing the space that felt so wide all of a sudden. "I don't know how to prove it, except to stand here," he said, voice quiet but steady. "I want to be here, with you, not anywhere else." He pulled something out of his pocket, a keychain with a tiny, battered bookstore card attached. "Come with me today," he said. Asterisk, no plans, just us. Asterisk, I wanted to say yes right away, but the old doubt sat heavy on my tongue. He saw it. He reached for my hand, held it between both of his like it was something fragile he planned to protect. "I know you've been hurt," he said. "I'm not him. I don't run when it matters. You don't have to believe me today. Just, don't close the door yet." In that moment, I realized the easiest thing in the world would be to step back into the comfort of my walls. But something in me leaned forward instead. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't flinch when they met mine, or maybe I was just tired of pretending I didn't want more, so I didn't push him away. I just nodded and let him hold my hand like it was the simplest truth we'd ever told. We didn't talk much on the walk to the bookstore that morning. There was something different about the silence between us now. Not heavy, not awkward, just real. Sometimes words get in the way of what you already know. He held my hand the whole way, his thumb tracing little circles on my skin like he was reminding me he was still there, still choosing this. Inside the store, the world shrank, down to just the two of us wandering through narrow aisles and crooked stacks of second-hand novels. He pulled out books and read random lines to me, half of them silly, some so beautiful they made me stop and really look at him. He didn't know how to pretend things were casual anymore. Neither did I. When we stepped out into the late afternoon sun, I could feel the quiet promise between us growing roots. He carried my books again, joked that my taste in poetry was too tragic for someone who smiles the way I do. I teased him back, saying maybe that's why I liked him, because he didn't flinch at the sad parts of me. He stopped walking for a second, looked at me like he wanted to memorize the shape of that sentence. We found a bench by the river, sat close enough that our shoulders touched. He asked about my dreams, not the sensible ones, but the ones I was too shy to say out loud. I told him I used to imagine writing something that mattered, something that made people feel less alone. He told me he thought I already did, just by being the way I was. I laughed it off at first, but he didn't let me hide behind it. He never did. I asked what he wanted. He thought about it longer than I expected. Then he looked at me and said, he wanted to build something that didn't fall apart just because life got hard. He wanted to wake up one day and realize he hadn't been waiting for the other shoe to drop, because he'd chosen someone who didn't know how to run away. It was the kind of honesty that settles deep under your ribs and stays there. I didn't say much back. I didn't need to. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt him breathe out like he'd been holding it all along. A week later, he asked if I'd help him unpack the last of his boxers. It wasn't about the boxers. It was about seeing if my coffee mug looked right next to his. About the little gaps in his closet he said I could fill if I ever wanted to. It wasn't a proposal, not a grand declaration. Just a door left open, wide enough for both of us to step through when we were ready. We spent that whole day surrounded by books and old records. His favorite mugs wrapped in newspaper. We played music too loud, laughed when we dropped things, stopped to dance for no reason except it felt like something we'd regret not doing. Every now and then I'd catch him looking at me like he was still surprised I was real and standing there with him. When it got late and the apartment smelled like leftover pizza and new beginnings, he found me sitting on the floor flipping through an old photo album. He sat beside me, his arm brushing mine. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched me look at pieces of his past he hadn't shown anyone in a long time. I asked about the people in the pictures, the places he'd lived before here. He answered every question, his voice softer each time. At one point I asked if he ever thought we'd have photos like this one day. He didn't laugh it off or change the subject. He just said, "Yeah, if you want that too." I didn't say yes right then, but I didn't say no either. I just leaned in and kissed him the way you kiss someone when you're tired of pretending you're not all in. After that night, things didn't suddenly turn into a fairy tale. We still had days when the old fears tried to creep back in. We still argued about little things, like whether the bed should be made in the morning or left undone until night. But the difference was that we didn't leave when it got uncomfortable. We didn't hide behind silence. We learned how to say what we needed, even when it scared us. He'd come up behind me while I was making coffee, wrap his arms around my waist, press his chin into my shoulder like he was reminding himself I was really there. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him watching me, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm, like he was writing something he didn't know how to say yet. One rainy evening, months later, I found the old paperback he'd first given me tucked into the back of my bookshelf. I flipped through it and found a note I hadn't seen before, a scrap of paper with his handwriting. Asterisk, if you're reading this, it means you didn't push me away. Thank you for staying. I sat on the floor with that book in my lap, the rain tapping on the windows the way it did the fur.